The moving truck rumbled down the quiet suburban street, its tires crunching against the pavement as it pulled into the driveway of a two-story house. Marcus Johnson stepped out of his black SUV, his sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood. It was an affluent, predominantly white area, well-manicured lawns, luxury sedans in every driveway, and the distinct hush of privilege. Angela Johnson, his wife, emerged from the passenger seat, stretching after the long drive. Her curly hair was pulled into a high bun, and she wiped a layer of sweat from her forehead. Their teenage son, Jason, hopped out of the back seat, earbuds still in, his gaze bouncing from house to house, already feeling like an outsider. "This is it," Marcus said, clapping his hands together. "Home sweet home." Angela gave him a sidelong glance. "You sound convinced." Marcus chuckled. "It'll take some time, but we'll settle in." As the movers began unloading furniture, Marcus caught sight of a man standing across the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a perpetual scowl on his face. The man, clad in a sleeveless undershirt and faded jeans, leaned against his pickup truck, arms crossed, watching them with an expression that could only be described as disdain. "Looks like we've got our first welcome party," Angela murmured under her breath. Marcus sighed. "Ignore him." The man didn't move. Instead, as if making a point, he spat onto the pavement before turning and walking back inside his house. "Guess we're not getting a fruit basket," Jason muttered. Marcus put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Don't let it get to you. Some people are just stuck in their ways." But deep down, Marcus knew trouble when he saw it. By the second week, the Johnsons had settled into their new home. The furniture was arranged, the kitchen was stocked, and Jason had started his new school. The only problem? Their neighbor, Earl Thompson. It started with the little things, side-eye glances whenever they crossed paths, muttered words that were just loud enough to hear but not quite clear enough to call out. Then it escalated. One morning, Marcus stepped out to find their garbage can tipped over, trash strewn across the lawn. He assumed it was an accident until it happened again. Angela found deep scratches along the side of her car, as though someone had deliberately dragged a key across the paint. Then there was the dog. Earl's pit bull, a massive beast named Duke, had developed a habit of wandering onto their property, leaving its mess on their freshly cut grass. Every time Marcus confronted Earl about it, the man would smirk and say, "Dogs don't know boundaries, Johnson. Maybe you should take a page from their book." One evening, after dinner, Jason sat on the porch scrolling through his phone when a beer bottle landed with a loud smash on their driveway. He jumped up, heart pounding. Across the street, Earl stood on his porch, an empty hand now hanging loosely by his side. "Whoops," Earl called out, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "Slipped right out of my hand." Marcus clenched his fists, his muscles tense. Angela put a hand on his arm. "Not like this," she whispered. Not on his terms. But Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "Just filing a report," he said evenly. "You know, in case anything escalates." Earl grinned. "Oh, I'm sure it won't. We're just neighbors getting to know each other." Something in his tone made Marcus uneasy. He had dealt with men like Earl before, bullies who thrived on intimidation, who pushed and pushed until they got a reaction. This wasn't over. 2 days later, a construction crew showed up outside the Johnsons' home. They began unloading wooden panels, placing them in neat stacks along the property line. "What's going on?" Angela asked, stepping onto the porch. Their answer came in the form of Earl, who swaggered onto his lawn with a mug of coffee in hand. "Building a fence," he said, taking a loud sip. "Figure we should have some proper separation between our properties. You folks like that, right?" Angela narrowed her eyes. "You didn't mention anything about a fence before." "Didn't have to." Earl flashed a toothy grin. "My land, my decision." Marcus watched as the workers began hammering the first wooden post into the ground. The fence was unusually high, higher than the standard regulations allowed. He made a mental note to check city zoning laws. But he knew Earl wouldn't care. By the end of the day, an 8-foot-tall wooden fence loomed between their houses, its dark wood almost ominous in the glow of the evening sun. That night, Marcus sat in his study, going through emails. When his phone vibrated, he glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Curious, he answered. "Hello?" A deep, distorted voice spoke on the other end. "You don't belong here, Johnson." Take your family and leave." Marcus sat up straight. "Who is this?" The line went dead. A slow, burning anger built in his chest. He had spent his entire life fighting against people like this, bigots who thought fear and intimidation could break a man. But he was no ordinary man. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, Jason left for school, headphones in, trying to block out the stress that had seeped into their home. He didn't get far before a group of older boys stepped into his path. "Hey," one of them sneered, shoving Jason's backpack off his shoulder. "You lost or something?" Jason clenched his jaw. "I'm just trying to get to class." The leader of the group smirked. "Yeah? Well, maybe you should think about getting lost, for good." Before Jason could react, the first punch landed. Pain exploded in his ribs as he staggered back. More fists followed. His world became a blur of fists and taunts. By the time a teacher broke it up, Jason's lip was split, his eye swelling shut. The other boys? Barely a scratch on them. When Marcus arrived at the school, his expression was stone cold. He spoke to the principal. But the response was dismissive, just boys being boys. Marcus knew better. That night, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection. Enough was enough. He stepped into his bedroom and opened a drawer in his nightstand. Inside lay his police badge, glinting in the dim light. It was time to remind these people exactly who he was. The night after Jason's attack, Marcus sat in his study, staring at the darkened window. His reflection gazed back at him, a reminder of the man he had become, the man he had fought to be. He had spent decades working his way up in law enforcement, proving himself time and time again, not just as a black man in a predominantly white field but as an officer who upheld justice above all else. And yet, here he was, in his own home, being harassed like he was nothing, like he was just another statistic. He opened his drawer and picked up his badge. The weight of it in his hands grounded him, reminded him of the power he wielded, not just as a police officer, but as the chief of police. They didn't know who they were messing with. Angela knocked on the door before stepping inside. "You're thinking about telling them, aren't you?" Marcus sighed. "I'm thinking about making a statement. This neighborhood, this man, thinks they can intimidate us. They don't know who they're dealing with." Angela crossed her arms. "Marcus, you've worked too hard for this. If you go in there guns blazing, it's just going to give them another excuse to paint you as the angry black man in a nice neighborhood. You know how they'll twist this." He clenched his jaw. She was right, of course. She always was. But that didn't mean he was going to stay silent. The next day, Marcus attended the monthly neighborhood meeting, held in a community center just a few blocks away. He and Angela walked in, drawing several sideways glances from the all-white crowd. Earl was already there, sitting with his usual smug expression. When Marcus took the floor, he calmly introduced himself. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marcus Johnson," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I moved here with my family 2 weeks ago. I also serve as this city's chief of police." The room felt deathly silent. Earl's smirk faltered. Marcus let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "My family and I have been dealing with harassment since the day we moved in. Vandalism, threats, even physical violence against my son." He looked around the room, making eye contact with several people who had chosen to remain silent. "And I want to make something very clear, this stops today." No one spoke. No one moved. The tension in the room was thick. Finally, Earl leaned forward, his grin returning. "You say you're a cop? Huh? That's supposed to scare us?" Marcus turned his gaze toward him, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. "It's supposed to warn you." That night, Earl sat on his porch, nursing a beer, his mind racing. Marcus being a cop, the chief of police, changed everything. He had thought the Johnsons were just another black family moving into a place they didn't belong. He hadn't expected this. He had power, connections, and that made him dangerous. Earl took a deep swig of his drink before reaching for his phone. He had friends, the right kind of friends, who wouldn't take kindly to a high-ranking black cop throwing his weight around. He dialed a number. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Got a problem?" Earl muttered. "Need it handled." The voice on the other end chuckled. "Say no more. We'll be in touch." 2 nights later, Marcus woke to the sound of breaking glass. He was out of bed in an instant, reaching for his gun from the nightstand. Angela bolted upright beside him. Marcus, stay here, he ordered before heading downstairs. The front window was shattered. Shards of glass littering the hardwood floor. The unmistakable stench of gasoline filled the air. A Molotov cocktail lay smoldering just outside their porch. Footsteps pounded outside. Marcus rushed to the door, flinging it open just in time to see a figure disappearing into the night. And then he heard the laughter. Across the street, Earl stood on his lawn, arms crossed, watching with amusement. Marcus stepped onto his porch, his gun still in hand. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he growled. Earl grinned. "Nah," he said, turning toward his house. "I think I just started something." The next morning, Marcus was in his office at the precinct, going through surveillance footage of his street from the night before. He was going to catch whoever did this. But then something caught his eye. In the footage, a figure loitered near his house long before the attack. Not just anyone, someone in a police uniform. His stomach twisted. Someone in his own department had been scoping out his house. A knock at his door made him look up. His deputy, Officer Ray Monroe, stepped in. "Chief, we got a situation," he said, his expression tense. "What now?" Monroe hesitated. "You got a letter." Marcus frowned. "A letter?" Monroe handed him a thick envelope. No return address. No markings. Marcus opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold black letters. "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." His grip tightened around the paper. "Where did this come from?" he demanded. Monroe shifted uneasily. "It was left in your office this morning. No cameras caught who put it there." Marcus exhaled slowly. His own station had been compromised. There was no doubt now. This wasn't just about a racist neighbor. This was bigger. Marcus knew Earl was behind the attack, but knowing it and proving it were two different things. Instead of going straight after him, Marcus decided to hit him where it hurt, his wallet. The next day, he filed a legal complaint against Earl for harassment, vandalism, and hate crimes. He knew the case would draw attention, and that was exactly what he wanted. And it worked. Within days, news vans began showing up in the neighborhood. Reporters hounded Earl for statements, forcing him to play the role of an innocent homeowner being attacked by the chief of police. "This is a witch hunt," Earl ranted on television. "That man thinks he can come into my neighborhood and change our way of life." Marcus smirked as he watched the broadcast. Earl was getting desperate, but he also knew desperate men were dangerous. And if Earl was willing to throw a Molotov cocktail, Marcus had no doubt the worst was yet to come. The tension in the neighborhood had escalated into something ugly, something tangible. The Johnsons could feel it in the way people averted their eyes when they walked down the street. In the silence that followed whenever Marcus entered a room, it wasn't just Earl anymore, his animosity had emboldened others. One evening, as Angela drove home from work, she noticed a group of men gathered outside Earl's house. Their presence was unnerving. Some stood with arms crossed. Others leaned against their trucks. And all of them stared as she pulled into the driveway. She gripped the steering wheel tightly and exhaled. Inside, Marcus was reviewing security footage from the previous nights when she walked in. Her face pale. "They're gathering," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stood up immediately. "Where?" "Earl's house. At least 10 of them." Marcus strode to the window. Peeking through the blinds, the men were still there, laughing, drinking, their eyes frequently flickering toward his house. Angela hugged herself. "This isn't just Earl anymore. He's drawing them in. Marcus, he's bringing them here." Jason appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "What's going on?" Marcus forced a reassuring smile. "Nothing you need to worry about." Jason didn't buy it, but he nodded. "I'll be in my room." Angela waited until their son was gone before she turned back to her husband. "We need to leave." Marcus stiffened. "I'm not running. This isn't about pride." "Marcus," she whispered fiercely, "we have Jason to think about. I won't have him growing up in a war zone." Marcus sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know you're scared, but this is exactly what they want, for us to give up. To slink away like we never belonged here. If we leave, they win." Angela pressed her lips together, her gaze searching his. "And if we stay, we might not survive." Neither of them said anything after that. That night, someone left a dead rat on their porch. Tied around its neck was a note. "Get out while you still can." The morning after the dead rat incident, Marcus stood in front of a lineup of his officers. all of whom had been handpicked to investigate the harassment his family had endured. He trusted these men and women, he had worked alongside them for years. Knew their character, but the events of the past few days had left him questioning everything. "Whoever did this wants us to be afraid," Marcus said, pacing in front of them. "They think we'll cower, that we'll let this slide. But this is bigger than me or my family now. We need to send a message." He turned to Detective Lisa Carter, one of his most reliable investigators. "I want surveillance on Earl Thompson and his associates. Phone records, financials, everything." Carter nodded. "Already on it, Chief." Marcus leaned against the desk, rubbing his temple. "This isn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. This is organized. Earl's not working alone." A young officer hesitated before stepping forward. "Sir, I don't mean to overstep. But, do you think this is coming from inside the department?" Marcus locked eyes with him. "I know it is." Later that day, Marcus met with his lawyer to push forward his legal battle against Earl. The charges of harassment and vandalism were just the beginning. The more he dug into Earl's past, the clearer it became that his crimes stretched far beyond what he had done to the Johnsons. The man had a record, a long one. Assault, disorderly conduct, even suspected arson, but he had always slipped through the cracks, protected by connections that ran deep. Not this time. Marcus made sure every news outlet got wind of it. The local media was all over the case now, painting Earl as a violent racist whose reign of terror was finally being brought to an end. Earl, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. That night, Marcus received a text from an unknown number. "Drop the charges, or your family won't make it to trial." Marcus clenched his jaw. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The attack came 2 nights later. Marcus had stayed late at the precinct, going over case files, when his phone rang. Angela's voice was frantic. "Marcus, the house, oh my God. Someone." Then came the explosion. Marcus's heart stopped. He grabbed his keys and sprinted out of the office, barking orders to dispatch as he raced home. By the time he arrived, flames were devouring the front of the house. Firefighters were already at work, but the damage was evident. The windows were shattered, and the porch was a blackened ruin. Angela and Jason stood on the lawn, shaken but unharmed. Marcus ran to them, pulling them both into his arms. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Angela was shaking, but she nodded. "We got out in time." "It was, Marcus. It was a firebomb. Someone threw it through the window." Jason looked up at his father, eyes blazing with anger. "They tried to kill us." Marcus turned toward the burning house, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sirens filled the night as police swarmed the scene. Officers ran up to him, waiting for orders. He took a deep breath. "This is no longer just a harassment case," he said coldly. "This is attempted murder." The next morning, Marcus held a press conference. He stood before a sea of reporters, Angela and Jason at his side, his police badge pinned proudly to his chest. "My family was attacked last night," he said, voice steady despite the rage boiling beneath the surface. "A firebomb was thrown into our home while my wife and son were inside. This was not an accident. This was an act of terrorism." Cameras flashed. The crowd murmured. "I want to make one thing very clear. Whoever is responsible for this will be found and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." He locked eyes with the cameras. "I don't care who they are. I don't care how powerful they think they are. No one is above the law." The press exploded with questions, but Marcus ignored them. He had work to do. Later that day, a breakthrough came. Surveillance footage from a gas station down the street had captured the arsonist buying supplies, gasoline, rags, a lighter. He was wearing a hoodie, face partially obscured, but Marcus recognized the build. He recognized the walk. Earl Thompson. And now, Marcus had proof. By nightfall, an arrest warrant was issued. The moment was finally here. Earl Thompson was about to face justice. Or so Marcus thought, because someone in the shadows still wasn't finished. And the real fight was just beginning. The police convoy rolled down the street, their sirens silent but their presence unmistakable. The neighborhood, which had grown tense over the past weeks, now felt suffocating under the weight of what was about to happen. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on Earl's house. This moment had been a long time coming. Earl Thompson had finally run out of places to hide. As the convoy came to a stop, Officers filed out in practiced formation. Marcus stepped out, his badge displayed clearly, his uniform impeccable. He wasn't just here to make an arrest. He was here to show the world that justice could not be bought, could not be ignored. A curtain in Earl's house fluttered. Marcus could see the shadowy movement behind it. "Chief," Detective Carter said at his side. "We've got a team at the back, in case he tries to run." Marcus nodded and signaled his officers forward. They climbed the porch steps, booted feet thudding against the wood. Carter knocked hard. "Earl Thompson, this is the police. Open the door." Silence. Carter knocked again. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Open up or we're coming in." The seconds stretched. Then, a voice, low and defiant. "Go to hell." Carter exchanged a look with Marcus, then nodded to the entry team. "Breach it," Marcus ordered. With a single, powerful kick, the door swung open, crashing against the wall. The officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. Earl was sitting in an armchair in his living room, a beer in one hand, a shotgun in the other. His eyes gleamed with something between amusement and hate. "You people just love breaking into my house," he sneered. Marcus stepped forward, voice calm but unyielding. "Put the weapon down, Earl." Earl took a slow sip of beer, then smirked. "You afraid, Chief?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Not in the slightest, but I do have a son to get home to tonight, so I'd rather not waste my time listening to your bullshit." For a moment, neither of them moved. The room was thick with unspoken history, an entire legacy of oppression, of defiance, of a man who had spent his whole life believing he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. And now, the law had finally come for him. Earl exhaled sharply, then tossed the shotgun onto the couch. "Guess I'll be needing a good lawyer." "Huh?" The moment the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus felt the weight of justice pressing down, not just for himself, but for every family that had ever been terrorized by a man like Earl. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The news of Earl's arrest spread like wildfire. Headlines blared the story across every channel, every newspaper. Local racist leader arrested in attempted murder case. Earl's mugshot was everywhere, his usual smug arrogance wiped clean by the cold reality of incarceration. But Marcus knew the backlash was coming. That morning, the police station's phone lines were flooded with calls. Some were messages of support. Others were threats. "You just made a big mistake. Chief, we know where your kid goes to school. This ain't over." Angela found a flyer taped to their front door. "Traitor." She ripped it down, her hands shaking. "Marcus," she said when he got home that night. "When does this stop?" Marcus sat heavily at the kitchen table, rubbing his face. "It doesn't." She slammed the flyer onto the table. "I can't live like this." He reached for her hand. "We're winning, Angela. They're scared because they know their time is up." Angela swallowed hard. "That doesn't make me feel safer." Jason, who had been silent through most of dinner, finally spoke. "I want to learn how to shoot." Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" Jason sat up straight, his expression hard. "I don't want to be caught off guard if they come for us again." Angela's eyes widened. "Jason, I'm serious. Mom, they tried to kill us." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I'll think about it." Jason's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're always telling me to be prepared. Isn't this part of it?" Angela looked at Marcus, pleading, "Don't do this." Marcus met his son's gaze. "We'll talk about it." That night, sleep did not come easy for any of them. The next day, Detective Carter knocked on Marcus's office door. "You need to see this," she said, her face unusually serious. She laid out a folder on his desk, filled with pages of surveillance reports, bank transactions, and police logs. Marcus flipped through them, frowning. "What am I looking at?" Carter pointed to a name. "Officer Daniel Keaton." Marcus's stomach dropped. Keaton had been on the force for years. He wasn't just some rookie, he was one of their own. Carter pulled up a grainy security image. "That's him," she said, "the night of the firebombing. Near your house." Marcus stared at the picture. His hands curled into fists. Carter lowered her voice. "He wasn't alone. We ran his financials. He's been taking money from a local extremist group." Earl's group. Marcus felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His own officer had been helping Earl all along. He took a deep breath. "Bring him in." The interrogation room was cold and sterile, but Marcus's fury burned hot. Keaton sat on the other side of the table, his hands cuffed, his expression unreadable. Marcus leaned forward. Tell me why. Keaton smirked. Why? Because you don't belong here. Johnson, you never did. Marcus clenched his jaw. You tried to kill my family. Keaton shrugged. I didn't throw the bomb. Marcus slammed his fists onto the table, making Keaton flinch. But you helped. You watched. And you let it happen. Keaton's smirk wavered. Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice to something deadly. You were supposed to protect people. Instead, you sided with a bunch of cowards who are too afraid of change to accept that their time is up. Keaton's nostrils flared. This country is not yours to control anymore. Marcus snapped. And you're going to rot in a cell while the world moves on without you. Keaton's jaw clenched. He knew it was over. Marcus stood up, signaling the guards. Take him away. As they dragged Keaton out, Marcus exhaled deeply. The fight wasn't over. But today, justice had won. And Marcus Johnson wasn't done yet. The walls of the precinct felt heavier than usual. Even after Keaton's arrest, Marcus knew this fight wasn't over. His enemies were still out there, watching. Waiting. The morning after Keaton was taken into custody, Marcus walked into his office to find his desk in complete disarray. His drawers had been pulled open, papers scattered. The framed photo of Angela and Jason that always sat on his desk was shattered. The glass cracked like spider webs. His stomach tightened. On top of the mess was a single sheet of paper with only 3 words scrawled across it in bold. Jagged ink. Drop the case. Marcus took a slow, measured breath. He had expected retaliation, but this was different. This was personal. Detective Carter appeared in the doorway. The moment she saw his desk, she stiffened. Jesus, Chief, you okay? Marcus picked up the note, rubbing his thumb over the ink. They're getting desperate. Carter folded her arms. That means we're winning. Winning. The word felt hollow. Marcus turned to her. Have Keaton moved to solitary? He won't last long if his friends decide he's a liability. Carter nodded, already pulling out her phone. You think this was done by someone inside? Marcus exhaled. I don't think. I know. Carter grimaced. What's the next move? Marcus clenched his jaw. We keep pushing. Harder. But deep down, he knew the deeper they dug, the more dangerous this was going to get. That night, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. Angela sat beside him, silent for a long time. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, How much longer are we going to do this? Marcus? He turned to her, his heart heavy. What do you mean? Angela swallowed hard. This fight, the threats, the attacks, we've sacrificed so much already. I don't know if I can keep watching you walk out that door every morning and wonder if you're coming back. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. Angela? She looked at him, eyes glistening with emotion. Jason is scared. Marcus. He won't say it, but I see it in his eyes. He's carrying a baseball bat to the front door every night before bed. He shouldn't have to live like this. We shouldn't have to live like this. Marcus ran a hand down his face. I know. Angela reached for his hand. Then tell me, when does it end? Marcus squeezed her fingers, but he had no answer. Outside, in the darkness, a black SUV was parked just down the street. Its engine was off, its headlights dimmed, and inside, 2 figures sat, watching the Johnson house, waiting. The attack came at 2:14 a.m. The Johnsons were asleep when the first bullet shattered their living room window. Marcus bolted upright at the sound, his instincts kicking in. Angela, get down. Jason's terrified voice echoed from his room. Dad? Angela scrambled out of bed as Marcus grabbed the gun from his nightstand. He rushed into the hallway just as another shot rang out, tearing into the wall. His heart pounded. He had faced shootouts before, but never in his own home. Angela was already pulling Jason into the bathroom, shoving a dresser in front of the door. Marcus took position near the staircase, gun aimed at the front door. Through the broken window, he saw movement. 2 men, both armed, both in masks. One of them lifted a rifle. Marcus fired first. The man went down with a shout. His partner ducked behind a car, returning fire. Marcus moved quickly, using the staircase for cover. His training took over, his breathing steady despite the chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance. Reinforcements were coming. The second man scrambled to escape, sprinting toward the black SUV waiting at the end of the block. Marcus aimed, finger tightening on the trigger. But the SUV peeled away, disappearing into the night. Silence fell over the street, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. Marcus exhaled sharply, lowering his gun. His hands were steady, but his rage was burning hot. Angela emerged from the bathroom, Jason clinging to her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus took a step toward them, his heart breaking. "Are you both okay?" Angela just stared at him. And in that moment, Marcus knew, this was the final straw. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. The next morning, the neighborhood was a crime scene. Officers swarmed the area, taking statements, gathering evidence. Detective Carter stood beside Marcus as they watched the forensic team bag the rifle from the front yard. "This was a hit," she murmured. Marcus nodded grimly. "A warning." Carter glanced at him. "What are you gonna do?" Marcus was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "I'm done playing defense." That afternoon, Marcus held a press conference. He stood at the podium, staring out at the sea of reporters. His face unreadable. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved forward. Then he spoke. "For the past several weeks, my family has been the target of threats, harassment, and violence. Last night, masked gunmen attacked my home while my wife and son slept." A murmur ran through the crowd. "This is not just about me. This is about every black family that has ever been told they don't belong. Every person who has ever been silenced by fear. But let me make something very clear, I am not afraid." The cameras zoomed in. "I have spent my entire career upholding the law. And now, I promise you this. I will not stop until every single person involved in this is behind bars." The reporters exploded with questions. Marcus stepped back from the podium. He had declared war. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Behind him, a task force of officers stood, ready. This was no longer just about a neighbor. No longer just about a racist man and his hatred. This was about cleansing the city of every last trace of this rot. Marcus turned to Carter. "Round up the entire extremist group. Every single one." Carter nodded. "Consider it done." As Marcus walked off the stage, Angela and Jason stood waiting for him. Angela reached for his hand. "Are we safe now?" she whispered. Marcus looked down at her. Then, slowly, he looked out at the city. The answer was no, but they were finally fighting back. And this time, he would not stop, no matter what it took.